And before this video begins, I'd just like to give a special thank you to my Asban Team level patron, Fallon Cortez. Thank you for supporting the channel. Ever since the ancient Sumerians gazed up at the stars at the wandering Nergal, Mars has been a fascinating jewel of the night sky. Whilst not our closest neighbour, Mars is the only other easily habitable planet in the solar system. So we've always dreamed and planned of settling that dusty orange surface. But what if someone else already had? That's the premise of Doctor Who's Empress of Mars, which reveals that the British Empire actually got there first all the way back in 1881, trying to colonise and mine the planet in the name of Queen Victoria, only to come face to face with the native ice warriors with all hell unfolding. But wait, who wrote it? Oh no. Empress of Mars is all about the Doctor and Bill stumbling across this conflict and trying to negotiate peace. But is it good? Well, as always, that's what I'm here to find out. So grab your closest classic British cup of tea and get ready for a trip to Mars, because it's time to take a deep dive into Empress of Mars.
So this could go very well, or very badly.
The episode starts with the Doctor paying another trip to NASA, which probably still hasn't forgiven him for the whole breaking into Apollo 11 incident. Come on, he was just a boy. I really do love how the TARDIS crew show up in the scene, completely undercutting the dramatic tension of the countdown with a great comedic sequence as first the Doctor shows up, then Bill, then Nardole, just this barrage of weird intruders confusing everyone. It's a really charming little scene, and I like moments like these that just highlight how out of place our protagonists are when they go somewhere normal.
Is this Neil Armstrong?
What?
But then things take an even weirder turn when NASA gets new pictures from the Martian surface, only to find out that good old Britannia got there first.
You're too slow, huh?
This is a fantastic hook for the episode, a great surreal visual to immediately sum up the main driving force of the story, and, rather obviously, giving the Doctor and his friends a reason to immediately make haste to travel to Mars.
So there were humans on Mars in Victorian times?
There's always been a bit of a fascination around photos from other planets, like the face on Mars, the Cookie Monster on Mercury, or the Pyramid of Cydonia, the latter of which inspires a lot of conspiracies and sci-fi to this day, although funnily enough, not Doctor Who's Pyramids of Mars, which actually predated the DNM Pyramid. I just find that funny. Anyway, given that Mars now has this very distinctive, unnatural rock formation that isn't just pareidolia, we're off to the races, with the Doctor, Bill and Nardole travelling to investigate. Hey, I'm sure it can't go any worse than the last time the Doctor went to Mars. The TARDIS then takes the intrepid trio to the caverns of Mars in 1881, when the message was supposedly made according to the TARDIS. And hey, if you're going to make a Victorian era story, you may as well take a more unique approach like this. Empress of Mars does a great job at making Bristol's Redcliffe Caves look really otherworldly with this great reddish hue to the rocks and the walls, making it genuinely feel like Martian rock and dirt. It's a great way of bringing the caverns to life. It also feels very surreal when they find the British camp in the depths of these caves, something that obviously doesn't belong. And let's face it, what's more Doctor Who than a British tea party on Mars with a giant lizard alien? It's great stuff, adding a very fun twist to the usual Mars setting. This is also where we meet Colonel Godzacre and his second in command, Captain Catchlove, whom the Doctor manages to convince to spill the beans on everything and give us all the exposition we need to understand why they're there. It works fine. Oh, and there's also this great piece of continuity with the painting of Queen Victoria sticking to the Pauline Collins version from Tooth and Claw. It's the little things that count. I do appreciate the elements of steampunk that manifest in this episode. From the spacesuits to the gargantua and even the goggles this one guy wears, it's a really nice aesthetic choice staying faithful to the anachronistic nature of steampunk, which is steeped in Victorian era retro-futuristic technology and steam-powered machinery.
You ain't heard? I'm steampunk now.
However, the soldiers themselves leave a lot to be desired. Of course, you have Godsaker and Catchlove who have their stories, but even they suffer from the same lack of depth and development as the rest of the soldiers. Catchlove is a very one-dimensional, power-hungry upstart officer with no real nuance. He's basically just a typical imperialist bad guy walking trope who only cares about control, and doesn't really have much of a backstory or rationale beyond that. He's not a very well-developed antagonist. Godsaker is slightly better, with the redemption arc of being a deserter who finds his bravery to save the others, but it still feels a bit forced and there's not much time or depth making this storyline feel more impactful. The motivations of Godsaker and Catchlove are clear and they do provide tension, but they feel way too much like archetypes than fully realised individual characters.
Honor must be satisfied, an eye for an eye!
I am in command here.
And then you get the rest, who just kind of exist and barely contribute to the narrative. They don't really have personalities, apart from Jackdaw and Vincey, who get like 5 seconds of characterization before dying and getting folded up like one of those scrap car cubes. It looks very goofy. And of course, Vincey's only characterization is a scene where he conveniently reminisces of his fiancée back home and how excited he is to marry her. Yeah, because that's never the biggest, most obvious death flag ever. It's a very lazy attempt at making you care about his fate or making you see him and the soldiers as anything more than just background characters. Basically, the only reason for these soldiers even existing at all is, well, 1, to die, and 2, to show the clash between the Victorian imperial mindset and the Martian ice warriors, establishing this episode's attempt at making an allegory for colonialism. Yes, Empress of Mars presents a clear critique of British colonialism, with the obvious presence of the Victorian era soldiers at the height of the British Empire.
I say, we weren't expecting company.
During the 19th century, the Empire constantly sought to expand its power and influence by occupying foreign lands and claiming them as British vassals, with little regard for the local populations or their cultures, because to be British was seen as being superior. The soldiers, led by Godsaker and Catchlove, see Mars as another territory to conquer and add to the British Empire, seeking to exploit their natural resources with the promise of treasures and resources, which reflects the common colonial mindset of exploiting native lands for wealth they feel entitled to. Catchlove himself particularly embodies these attitudes of imperial superiority, seeing the Ice Warriors as more savages that need to be subjugated, the same way people in the British Empire saw the populations of India or African countries like Kenya, Egypt, Uganda, and so many others. There was always an assumption that British power is superior, and that the Empire had a right to these places just because, which is reflected as Catchlove regularly disregards the sovereignty of the Ice Warriors, who are the native population of Mars after all.
And they're the proper Martians, right? They belong here.
As has been explained many times before in Doctor Who, the Ice Warriors are the rightful inhabitants of Mars, with a rich history and culture rooted in honour and warfare. They're a proud race, but the British soldiers don't understand that culture, history or power of the Ice Warriors and disregard them, much like how real-world colonisers misunderstood or outright ignored the traditions and values of the indigenous populations they were subjugating. The soldiers in this episode refuse to see the Ice Warriors as equals, let alone the superior race they actually are. Instead, they see Mars as a barren land to be claimed for themselves.
Claim Mars in the name of Queen Victoria. To loot it of its riches. Stake a claim.
When they accidentally awaken the Empress Iraxa by stealing gems from her tomb, it's symbolic of colonizers' frequent disregard for sacred sites and cultural artifacts of native peoples. Much like the excavation of ancient Egyptian tombs and religious sites with the sole purpose of finding riches and treasures, instead of a genuine interest in understanding the history and the rich culture of Egypt. The soldiers view Iraxa's tomb as a prize to be plundered and taken back to sit in the British Museum, rather than recognising it for the cultural and historical significance it has to the Ice Warriors' heritage and society.
This could be the entrance to an Ice Warrior hive.
But the Doctor does understand and respects this culture and history, so he constantly tries to warn the soldiers to respect the Martians, knowing how their reckless actions can and will provoke a deadly conflict. He also knows it's just wrong and immoral to subjugate independent native populations, so his stance mirrors that of real-world advocates for cultural preservation, who argue for the protection and respect of indigenous people's rights. He constantly challenges the colonial mindset of the soldiers, trying to help them realize their approach is obviously very harmful and short-sighted. His approach really underscores the need to engage with other cultures in good faith and on equal terms, not as conquerors or grave robbers. However, whilst the episode does successfully touch upon these themes of colonialism and imperialism, this exploration remains very surface level and pretty one-dimensional.
We're British. Mars is part of the Empire now.
The Victorian soldiers invading Mars and their exploitative treatment of the Ice Warriors could have been used to explore the deeper, complex consequences of colonial expansion. The conflict is very simplified and ends up resolved pretty quickly, so there's no chance for the episode to take a more in-depth look at the more long-term consequences of colonization and the cultural or societal damage it causes. The soldiers' presence doesn't really feel like it gets fleshed out nearly as much as it should, and they actually just end up being pretty stereotypical. Obviously, colonialism is built upon aggression, greed, and a callous disregard for native cultures, but there are still some moral grey areas to be explored, along with the more nuanced long-term impacts of technological and infrastructure development. It just feels weird to tell a colonialism story without an actual colony. I feel like they should have added a lot more depth to the soldiers and their motivations. Do they all believe they're doing the right thing? Surely one or two have their own doubts or reservations about what they're doing to other cultures. When you're making a story with this kind of narrative and these kinds of themes, you need to go all in. But Empress of Mars doesn't. It keeps everything so surface level, without the necessary depth. One of these missed opportunities is the presence of Friday, an ice warrior who crashed on Earth and brought these soldiers to Mars under the pretense of giving them the treasure the planet hides.
Christ alive. Look at the gild on that thing.
Obviously, he's meant to be an analogue to the local guides the British colonies used, again like with Egyptian excavations for example, but his role in the episode is pretty messy and inconsistent. In theory, he should play a crucial role in bridging the gap between the two sides of the conflict, since he's pledged to Araxa but also owes his life to the soldiers who saved him and seemingly at least treat him well.
You alright, Friday?
But on paper, they don't really explore this loyalty and how Friday would struggle to ally himself with either side. I know he helps the Doctor and Bill seeking peace, but he has such a negligible impact on the second half of the story, it feels like a waste of an intriguing premise.
You have forged a new alliance, I see.
You'd think he would be the shining example of cultural and societal cooperation that inspires Araxa to make peace, but they don't go in that direction, and it kind of highlights how bland the Ice Warriors end up being in the story. Obviously, they're once again portrayed as warriors driven by honour and duty like they always are, but they're not given much emotional depth or complexity. The episode doesn't explore much of their culture in a meaningful way, and it doesn't add much to their motivations, character dynamics, or history. The story tries to update them to match the more complex storytelling of the 12th Doctor era, but the actual Ice Warriors themselves feel no different to their last appearance in Cold War. Considering this is the first time we've actually had a TV episode exploring the Martian Ice Warriors on, well, Mars, it feels like a huge missed opportunity to actually take a deeper look at their race, their customs, their history, and their wider society. It really could have been done so much better. Of course, the single new addition to the lore of the Ice Warriors is the titular Empress, or Ice Queen, who is revealed as the highest authority for an Ice Warrior hive, upgrading from the distinctive commanders we had seen in Classic Who. Araxa is woken when Jackdaw disturbs her tomb by trying to steal the gems within. The tomb looks absolutely fantastic, all these glittering jewels and the giant orange crystals. It's a beautiful otherworldly visual, and I do like the effect as the golden cocoon of Araxa melts away, revealing the green underneath. But Araxa herself is a middling character. She looks okay, I guess, and her fierce sense of leadership is a sharp contrast to the fractured loyalties amongst the human soldiers. The honourable culture of the Ice Warriors contrasts with the humans' dishonourable imperial ambition. As a leader, Araxa's motivations are very straightforward, seeking justified revenge after being disturbed and attacked. But she doesn't really evolve much beyond this basic warrior queen figure, which definitely makes the ending feel a bit out of character. Probably the most value Araxa has in this story is how she challenges traditional gender roles, especially within the context of Victorian society, which ironically looked down on women despite being ruled by one. Araxa sharply contrasts with this rigidly patriarchal worldview because her ability to command respect and wield immense power is a direct challenge to those old Victorian notions of women having to be seen, not heard, confined to domestic or subordinate roles, and not even being able to vote yet. Just look at how Godsaker scoffs at the idea of Bill being in the police force because, yeah, those were the attitudes of the time. Speaking of Bill, she has a decent role in this story, with Araxa valuing her opinion more than all those squabbling men. Araxa's respect for Bill and her listening to the companion further shows that matriarchal approach for the Ice Warriors. Since Bill is a modern character reflecting the modern audience, she's there to highlight the changing attitudes towards women and the more modern condemnation of colonialism and imperialism, because she questions the ethics of the British soldiers, opening up those moral discussions and explorations about history and the darker aspects of our past.
I'm gonna make allowances for your Victorian attitudes because, well, you actually are Victorian.
But once again, things feel undercooked, especially because so much of her time is spent on a random movie reference subplot that feels incredibly forced.
Like in the Terminator.
Oh, it's like the underground tunnels in The Thing. Like the Vikings.
Like Frozen.
It's a movie.
It's a movie.
It's a movie.
Nardole is also a complete non-entity in this episode, mainly because it was written before Matt Lucas actually signed on for Series 10. So writer Mark Gatiss just unceremoniously dumped him out of the episode with a half-assed side plot with Missy. Yeah, when the protagonists first arrive on Mars, Nardole goes back to the TARDIS and it just leaves for plot reasons. Yeah, we never even get an explanation as to why it pieces out like this. Even the Hads would have been a more suitable and understandable reason, like in Cold War, but we don't even get that. Nardole's subplot is completely pointless, contributing nothing to the episode. He's not even comic relief like he usually is. He basically goes back to St. Luke's, asks Missy for help to get back to Mars, and then they go back to Mars. It's so tacked on and a complete waste of time. Anyway, back in the dusty caverns of the Red Planet, the tensions between the Ice Warriors and the humans are growing worse, with the invasive soldiers pushing the natives into full-blown conflict, especially as Catchlove reveals Godsaker's past desertion and leads an impulsive mutiny, taking control and commanding his forces to destroy the Ice Warriors and to conquer Mars, because he's an egotistical idiot who completely underestimates the power and strength of the Ice Warriors.
I dare say the British Army is more than a match for a bunch of upright crocodiles.
And these battle scenes are pretty fun, the Ice Warriors sneaking past the British defences with this great surprise attack. One of my favourite recurring aspects of Doctor Who is seeing such vast mismatches. The first Russell T Davies era loved doing this, pitting humans and our inferior weaponry against Daleks, Cybermen, and even Ood or a werewolf. There's just something so satisfying about seeing bullets ping off the iconic Ice Warrior armour, really emphasising just how one-sided this fight is and that the humans have no chance, no matter how confident and arrogant Catchlove is. They can't even take one Ice Warrior down, let alone the constant stream of them now coming out of the hives. Although, again, we don't get to see much of the conflict because it's over so quickly, which is a shame. Yeah, the pacing and structure of Empress of Mars feels so inconsistent. The opening where the protagonists arrive and meet the soldiers is very drawn out and slowly paced, which is fine for building atmosphere, but it's the typical Mark Gatiss problem of writing like it's classic Who, thinking he has way more time than he actually does. The narrative takes way too long to get to the central conflict, making that whole first half feel pretty sluggish. But then when we actually get to the conflict, it only lasts for about 2 scenes, and then it's over and the climax comes so quickly. The decision to resolve things peacefully arriving far too neatly and quickly. The whole episode just feels so weirdly structured, but that's kind of Gatiss' trademark when it comes to Doctor Who episodes, so at least his pacing inconsistency is consistent. And in the midst of all the fighting, we end up with the exact same situation as the end of Cold War, with the Doctor threatening mutually assured destruction if the fighting doesn't cease.
We must live together, or die together.
Yes, as usual, it all comes down to the Doctor to be the peacekeeper, taking on this role as a mediator between the Ice Warriors and the humans. Because of course he would, he's always sought to avoid bloodshed and find peaceful resolutions. It's kind of his whole thing. The whole episode, the Doctor has been trying to act as this mediator, pushing for diplomacy and dialogue instead of letting the situation escalate into violence like it does. And of course, right as Araxa seems to be thinking about accepting this peace, Catchlove decides to take her hostage and use her to escape the planet, because we can't have nice things. But conveniently, Godsaker is ready in the lift to kill Catchlove. How very convenient of him. Anyway, he offers his life in exchange for the lives of his men, trying to reclaim his lost valor and atone for his past cowardice. It's a decent redemption arc, but the episode never really gets you to care enough about him for this to be a big heroic moment, so it falls a bit flat. Regardless, Araxa is moved to mercy because she's a leader of integrity and strength, compared to the rash, dangerously ambitious, and, when push came to shove, cowardly Catchlove.
Oh, sod this for a game of soldiers.
Therefore, Godsaker becomes an honorary soldier of the Ice Warriors, pledging his allegiance to his new reptilian queen, with Mars restored to its rightful owners. It's a hopeful ending that reinforces the theme that peace is a choice and that there's always a path to coexistence, especially when it comes to respecting other cultures, and not trying to colonize indigenous lands. It's a commendable, very Doctor Who message, but yeah, it just does feel like it happens way too easily and quickly. After all that build up, the resolution just happens instantly, and I think it really lessens the emotional impact of the ending. We do then get a nice yet very random cameo by Alpha Centauri from the classic Who Peladon stories, who invites the Ice Warriors to join the Galactic Federation. Oh yeah, quick reminder, this episode was actually almost completely different, being a return to Peladon and drawing parallels to Brexit, similar to how the original Peladon stories are often seen as analogues for joining the EU. But apparently Moffat thought that the cobbled castle visuals of Peladon would be too similar to the Eaters of Light, so it got changed.
Disgusting!
Much like the peace resolution, the arrival of the Galactic Federation also feels a little quick and convenient. But hey, at least it gives us the classic bootstrap paradox of the Doctor, Bill and Godsaker making the sign that brought the TARDIS team to Mars to begin with. I always love a bit of the bootstrap. Oh, and we also get a really weird cliffhanger with Missy asking if the Doctor is alright, with her delivery making it seem like it's meant to be some big enigmatic moment or a hint towards something, but it just never gets elaborated on. It's such a weird ending.
Really? Are you alright?
I'm gonna be real with you guys, I really don't like Empress of Mars, and I swear that's not just because it denied us an interesting Peladon story and a follow-up to Sleep No More in one fell swoop. Seriously, out of 3 ideas, Gatiss really ended up bowing out with the worst of them all. I've never really cared much for the Ice Warriors, so their appearance in this episode doesn't really do anything for me, and even then, it doesn't really do much with them anyway. It just feels like Cold War but on Mars instead of a submarine. Don't get me wrong, I do enjoy the Mars setting and the surreal nature of Victorian era soldiers somehow being on the planet centuries before anyone else. It's a fun hook for the episode, but it doesn't do enough with it. The soldiers are so one-dimensional, and it definitely gets frustrating to hear their stereotypical chaps and "good golly governor" speak after the billionth time. I appreciate the themes of colonialism and the critique of the British Empire, but it ends up feeling pretty surface level, and the satire doesn't even feel that deliberate, because Gatiss clearly has some sort of weird patriotic reverence for Britain. Nardol's pointless subplot is also kind of annoying. It really didn't need to exist. I do like some of the music of the episode though. There's some good theremin sounding vibes helping to reinforce the steampunk B-movie atmosphere of the story. Empress of Mars runs into a lot of the same issues as Lie of the Land just before it, with loads of fantastic, great concepts that get lost and fumbled in a bland and rushed episode. Therefore, Empress of Mars gets the exact same rank, a D on the tier list. It's just not very good in my opinion. It's full of typical Gatiss flaws, and it ends up being incredibly forgettable, and you don't really find yourself wanting to revisit it. Is it the worst episode of Series 10? You'd think so, but no, the suffering has only just begun. But that's the story for next time. What do you think of Empress of Mars? Let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye. And I'd just like to give a special thank you to my Asbantium level patron Fallon Cortez, my Platinum level patron Matthew Burns, and my Gold level patrons Chris Douglas and Daniel Shillito. Thank you so much for your support.